Adam hid in the bushes, waiting, targeting the monk, as a hunter would his prey. The father carried the same spear that Father Wicklow had. The piece of cloth at its tip fluttered in the wind. His desire to know the story of Ari and the whereabouts of the artifacts had overwhelmed him with zeal. His mission for the church and the king had now become a personal quest of faith. He knew that if God had led him to the book, he would truly be blessed and worthy of his robes, and the accolades that the king and the holy fathers would bestow upon him. His patience and faith paid off. The father left the cave entrance unaware of Adam's scrutiny. Adam didn't know what he'd find in the subterranean dwelling, but he suspected that the lance and the book were either in there, or he'd stumble across a clue to their whereabouts. The only person he'd seen enter and exit the cave during his vigil was the monk. Many clerics chose the simple and solitary space of a cave for meditation and prayer, but in Adam's experience, the higher the position in the church, the more luxurious were the clergy's lodgings. He'd always assumed that it was the well-deserved reward for a life of devotion and a vow of poverty. Adam left the security of the underbrush and walked toward the cave. Dry leaves and dead needles crunched under his feet, with an occasional loud snap from a twig. He continuously scanned his surroundings for signs of approaching natives or Chaldees. As he approached, he felt a cold, damp breeze blowing from the opening, accompanied by a moldy odor. He entered with trepidation, but trusted that since his faith had led him this far, it would safely lead him farther. Inside the cave he paused, temporarily blinded until his eyes adjusted to the dark interior. Finally, he saw the outline of what looked like prayer books and some writing instruments. In the far corner was a bed, and beside it a cold hearth. There were books piled up in nooks and crannies in the rock walls, but without light, he didn't know how anything written in them would be of any help to his search. The Book of Kells could not be among these books, Adam thought. It is too important to be left in the open where someone could look at it or even take it. No, the book was probably hidden, protected by ingenious anti-theft devices in an underground reliquary. He noticed an opening that was cleverly concealed behind an outcropping of rock. The entranceway was angled away from the cave entrance and therefore was not illuminated by light from without. Each side of the rock wall appeared uniform when seen from the angle of the cave entrance, but once he got closer and stared at it from a 45-degree angle, the pattern broke up, and a narrow but passable break in the wall was visible. A human body could fit through it. Adam wasn't sure if his could, though. He put his head through the opening. Beyond was a narrow passage, and beyond that, blackness. He sucked his gut in as much as possible and tried to squeeze himself through the opening. He pushed and tugged, gave up and tried another angle, then another angle, and finally returned to his first position. This time he wiggled his bum, first side to side, then by thrusting his pelvis forward. With each movement, Adam made a little progress. He straightened his back and lay the back of his head against the rock and rested for a moment. His squished stomach oozed out on either side of the opening. With one final exhalation and a simultaneous push, Adam fell through the other side of the opening. He remained on the ground and pulled the bottle from his pocket. Without sitting up, Adam tipped his head forward, raised the bottle in a thankful fashion toward the cave ceiling, then took a gulp. He rolled over with a groan and stood, mildly disoriented and swaying. There seemed nothing around him but gray space and the hard interior wall. Adam's hands were his only guides. His left hand felt along the jagged rock wall, while his right hand groped in front of him, as if trying to push the darkness away. He blindly navigated farther into the tunnel. He heard noises around him, and he could have sworn that something was either buzzing or hanging in front of him, crawling or slithering along the floor. The thought of being bitten by a snake and tempted into contradicting God's authority, or worse, taking knowledge that was forbidden to him, used against his belief, mortally scared Adam. His shoulders tensed with the possibility of unknown creatures to which his psyche could assign evil thoughts and purposes. In spite of his nervousness, the tunnel could not stop Adam. No other assignment was this important. No other cause he participated in had the same immediacy. Its difficulty was reminiscent of his faith. Failure was not permissible. Without a torch, his trip was slow and arduous. This was the other side of his faith. Traversing dark tunnels, stepping into the unknown. Faith was easy when everything was going well, but when the darkness of doubt shadowed the light, faith became a slow journey down a dark tunnel, with only a dim gray light at the end of it. Though Adam experienced almost paralyzing fear, the importance of the book and the lance refocused his intent. He decided that one life was worth the ascension of a king and the stability of a kingdom. If it was God's will, he'd be willing to be a martyr for his faith. He felt in his pocket for his bottle and took the last swig of the tart wine. The moment Adam stepped into his fear, he was always shown that the actual outcome was never what he'd imagined it to be. But cowardliness never is. As the wall curved in a sloping turn, a glow permeated the tunnel's darkness. Then a sliver of the faintest light shone on Adam's hand. He looked up to see rays of light shooting across the width of the tunnel, catching on the dust in the air. His outstretched hand grabbed for the light as if he were grabbing hold of a tether that would pull him to the end of the tunnel. His entire posture changed from hunched fear to energetic poise. His pace quickened and his strides lengthened. The sliver of light quickly grew into a shaft of light, then into flickering shadows jumping along the wall. Recklessly, Adam burst into the chamber without regard for his safety. His beacon was a single torch attached to a sconce on the wall. Adam's entire body exhaled in relief, and his error in judgment had not brought him face to face with another person. A central hearth provided a glowing light source and kept the room dry and warm. The floor was not of dirt, but rather sloping rock. The higher elevation of the rock floor would be much preferable to a dirt floor, not just for comfort, but for the preservation of the books along the walls and the contents of the chests and sealed clay jars resting on the floor. The jars probably held scrolls, a form of archiving that dated back to ancient times. The chests, when he tried them, were locked. To the left of these were several niches holding stacks of books. Adam felt that he was very close. That the monks took this much care to keep this chamber hidden and climate-controlled indicated the importance of its contents. He quickly went to work, lifting the heavy volumes out of the niches one by one, and opening their heavy wooden covers, then laying each on an easel and brushing dust off the cover, so he could read the engraved title. He was looking for clues, something that would bring him closer, if only by small steps, to finding the artifacts and Ari. Adam pulled down another volume and another. Most of the books were works of a scientific or scholarly nature. Some books were older than the colony itself. He put aside a copy of Aristotle's second book of poetics on comedy and pulled forward the book underneath. Chiseled into the cover was the name Marsson. He grabbed the wall torch and slid it into a crevice just above his head. He opened the book to the title page. The laborious and shaky handwritten script read, "The Events of My Journey to Greater Ireland, a Truthful Account by Ari Marsson." A folded piece of translucent cloth dropped onto the floor. Adam picked it up and unfolded it to see a hand-drawn map. Various sections of the map were labeled Vinland, Helluland, Markland. He folded it back up, thinking nothing of it. From a pocket inside his robe, Adam pulled a parchment with a confirmed sample of Ari's handwriting on it. He laid the scrap next to the title. The handwriting matched. This book was without a doubt the writings of Ari Marsson. He hunched over the book, carefully turned the page, and began reading. I am endeavoring to write down the events that led me to this land, which the Chelai Dei named Greater Ireland. It was not my intention to land here and to find these pious monks, but I now understand that the events that led me here to his holy land were meant to be, that I might be given atonement for my crimes through the sacrament of the baptism. I accept the fact that God has led me here to answer for and to seek absolution for my crimes, but I also know that he led me here to lead his people as Moses and Jesus did before me. My journey began on a merchant ship of no great importance or distinction. I was hired as one of its rowers. It's only worth mentioning because from the very beginnings of the trip, there were strange happenings. Our destination was nowhere in the British Isles. Some say it was Ireland, but no one was willing to confirm that. We were told to keep to our work and not to think or ask questions. In actual fact, I was not hired. I took the place of another sailor whom I murdered. I stole his identity by speech so that I could take his place. If I am to tell the truth, then I believe that the lies are a good place to start. King Harold's soldiers hunted me for crimes of rape and robbery. The only logical progression of this life was murder for personal gain. Another strange occurrence was that we didn't load cargo onto the Nar, only supplies. 2 men led the voyage, a Norse owner and an Irish abbot. They didn't share any instructions or details of what our duties would be when we reached our destination, only that under no circumstances were we to leave the ship. We suspected that the cargo was human rather than objects, but every one had a duty, and no one stood out from what I thought of as the crew. During what was supposed to be a 4-day voyage, unusual events continued to be the norm. The crew were, not surprisingly, suspicious about why we were ordered not to go down into the fore-cargo hold. We were permitted only in the aft hold, where our supplies were stored. Guards, which comprised half of the crew, took turns guarding the hold. Otherwise, they wandered around the ship with very little to do but watch us. These men were not experienced sailors, but were quick with a sword and the edge of a shield for those who didn't follow instructions. Rumors abounded as to why guards protected an apparently empty hold. Some said that the hold was not empty and that the cargo was secretly stored before the crew arrived. Others were of the opinion that the cargo hold was empty and that we were to pick up secret cargo and return it to Iceland. There was mention of a meeting with high officials in the Irish Church, which would explain why the hold was off limits to us. Rumors of revolution to overthrow the kings of Europe kept us awake and thinking during the long, cold North Atlantic nights. But the most unusual thing was how late in the season the voyage commenced. It was dangerous for prolonged voyages at this time of year. It was as if the planners felt that they didn't have a choice or the purpose outweighed the risks. At the end of the first day, the rowers and the steerboard man were told to rest in the supply hold. The waters had calmed, and we were told that our strength was needed for the following day. One lookout man remained on deck, scouting the waters. We had just finished eating some dried meat when I heard a roar that I had heard once before, and prayed that I would never hear again in my lifetime. I crawled to the hold's opening and looked up through the darkness to the shaft of light entering the hold from the lamps on deck. It was like the sun shining through the fog at dusk. I could see the fear in the eyes of my shipmate, Tory. Just as I had, he recognized that horrendous sound for what it was. It had started out as an almost unnoticeable rumble, lost in the background noise that an experienced sailor filtered out. Then it rapidly grew into a thunderous roar, so loud that we had to cover our ears. Tory and I jumped through the hole and onto the deck. Even in the darkness of the ocean night, I saw the starry sky veiled by a wall of water rapidly coming towards us. "Turn us into it," I heard. The voice sounded distant, but I turned to see the order coming from the Norseman standing next to me. I didn't know if it was my panic or if the deadly wave had surrounded us, but I no longer saw the heavens. It was as if the Norse gods had abandoned us and we were left alone to the wrath of the Christian one. I felt the ship tipping, then flowing water pushed me back into the hold. The last thing I remembered was the sound of my head hitting the edge of the open hold. I awoke with dim light all around me. At the time I didn't know it, but I was looking out of the hold entrance above me. The light blinded me, and I thought that I was resting in Valhalla, that I'd finally reached the end of my life's journey to begin a new life as a warrior. The creaking, yawing of the ship chased away that thought. I returned to the Nar and remembered the events that brought me to this instance. I slowly lifted my head and felt a sharp pain, like that of a drunkard waking up the morning after a night of heavy drinking. I tenderly touched the right side of my head and felt dried blood matted in my hair and beard. I rolled over and felt the pain of a second injury on my left side, where I'd obviously landed when washed onto the lower deck. I had survived the storm, but how damaged the ship was I did not yet know. We were still afloat, so perhaps Odin in league with the Christian god had deemed me worthy and had spared my life. I forced myself up to search for other crew members and to find out what had happened. My search had momentarily subsided, and I realized how cold the hold was. I was shivering uncontrollably. My wet toes were numb inside my stiff boots. I could still move them, so they were not yet damaged by the cold. My body ached with each movement. I tried to ignore the jabbing pain in my side, the pounding pain on the side of my head, and the burning pain in my lower back. The deck was at a precarious angle. Water had leaked into the hold and kept the keel just above the waterline. The wool sail was still intact, but the mast was broken in 3 places. All that remained of the 30 crew and passengers were 8 bodies strewn across the deck in haphazard positions. The rest must have been washed overboard. The wooden debris served as headstones that marked the position of each body. I gazed at the cemetery in front of me and couldn't believe that this was all that remained of the crew. The sky looked like it would explode again into another storm at any moment. Black and gray clouds menaced me. They rolled and churned, mixing their deadly brew into another fatal concoction. I struggled to the side and looked overboard. The boat was struggling to remain on the surface of the water. Even with the angle of the tilt, the waterline was almost to the edge of the deck. With its every movement, the ocean threatened to spill more and more water into the boat. The supplies in the aft hold must have shifted in the storm, I thought. They're keeping the ship at this angle. If I redistributed the cargo, the Nar would settle back on her keel again. The northern wind blew through me and I shivered more and more uncontrollably. My clothes were soaked, and it felt as if I was standing naked in the wind. If I was to remain alive, I needed to find some dry clothes. I looked around. Most of the bodies on the deck had a thin sheet of ice over their skin and clothing that crunched with the slow bobbing of the ship. The monk's limp body lay before me, clad in its heavy wool habit. It was the only body whose clothing was still relatively dry. Matted blood in his hair revealed the fatal blow to the side of the head that sent him from this world to the next. It seemed that in calling his servant to their heaven, the Christian God has saved my life. I quickly stripped the clothes from the body and changed into them. Now that my immediate survival had been taken care of, I set to the task of examining my location and surroundings. My inexperience as a Viking made it difficult for me to read the currents and to know in which direction I was being taken. I did know that I was adrift and that a current was carrying me somewhere, but where? I had no means of navigating the waters. I looked out beyond the keel. Now that I had taken several steps back from death, a blanket of white draped the ocean, interrupted only by the rhythmic movement of the water. Growlers occasionally thudded against the bottom of the ship, followed by the lap of waves against the side of the Nar. The wind blew into my ears. Those were the only sounds I heard. If I stopped and closed my eyes, I imagined my body riding on the wind, drifting with the light carrying touch of the Valkyries on my arms and feet. But as quickly as my thoughts traveled skyward, the images in my mind collapsed, and I returned to the Nar, still adrift on the serpent's back with the howling wind stinging my face. Drowsiness began to overtake me, due to a combination of the cold and hunger. My inexperienced body and unskilled mind made my fear and frustration all the more palpable. At the time I didn't know it, but I later found out that this was a normal, bodily reaction to my environment. I hunched my shoulders and wrapped the habit around me as I felt the numbing cold and the sting in the wind intensify. I looked out beyond the side of the boat, that the mist was clearing. Suddenly I heard voices. Not words, but the intonations of human speech. I squinted into the mist, trying to see the owners of the voices. I feared the worst, remembering stories of evil men and monsters on the water, ready to attack voyagers. But they were just stories, and I wasn't ready to lie down and die yet. The mist twisted and churned with activity. I saw 2 dark, ghostly objects gliding through the water toward me. As the objects moved closer and closer, I made out more and more of their detail, until I could see what they were. 4 men sitting in 2 small boats. They were wrapped in white furs and paddling boats of white, gray, and tan. The moment they looked up and saw my waving hands, they stopped paddling. They were so still, it was as if the cold wind had instantly frozen them. No longer propelled by their passengers, the small boats flowed in the current with the Nar. They gently placed their paddles inside the boat next to them, and stood up in perfect balance, even though the boats bobbed up and down. And then they did something totally unexpected. They knelt down on the floor of their oblong crafts and bowed toward me in reverence. I could not explain this odd behavior. Seeing me in monk's robes could have provoked this response, but how could they know? Unless they'd encountered monks or priests before seeing me. That had to be the answer. It was the only conclusion that made sense. They rose, and one of them, with a grin on his face, as if he knew me, extended a welcoming hand. The others paddled the boats closer and kept them steady along the side of the Nar. Hesitantly, I extended my hand and gripped his arm, allowing myself to be taken aboard their boat. I knew that I couldn't survive out in the elements much longer. My only choice was to trust that my gods were guiding me in the right direction. Now that I was almost face to face with one of them, I could see that their faces were unlike anyone's that I had encountered. Perhaps these people were what my people referred to as scrawlings. They had puffy red cheeks, and their eyes were frozen in a squint. I was gently placed on luxurious white furs. The man behind me draped another fur over my shoulder and wrapped it around my body. The fur tickled my chin and nose as the cold northern wind blew through the nap. I settled into the warmth of the pelts. My rescuer turned 180 degrees and paddled back into the mist. The other boat stayed behind, I assumed to check the ship for other survivors, something that I hadn't thought of doing while I was on board. I was under such distress, it had not occurred to me. I was happy to be off that death ship. I wish that I could honestly say my reason was just to be en route to dry land, but the truth of the matter was that I detested the thought of death near me. I didn't consider myself a violent man. I usually obtained what I wanted through more clandestine means, though I was not against murder. In fact, the strong should take from the weak, including life. It's how the natural world works. My destination was as concealed as the ocean around me. I couldn't tell in which direction we were headed. But one thing did occur to me, now that the thought of my survival was no longer weighing heavily on my mind. I must have been drifting in a current that passed very close to a shoreline, or how else could the natives travel to meet me in such small boats? I let my escorts worry about taking us to our destination. My eyes were very heavy and they were beginning to burn. The side of my head still ached from the earlier impact, though the pangs were slowly subsiding. My hours on the ship had been filled with such worry and preoccupation that I hadn't noticed the pain, but now that my mind was at rest, all of my discomforts resurfaced. Strange that I never once thought of these men as my captors. I do not know why, but their demeanor and constitution were worthy of trust with my safety. If indeed these were the natives rumored to be murderers and savages that I had heard much about, they were in my opinion labeled unfairly. Their paddling seemed effortless in the choppy water. Small rounded blocks of ice drifted past us. Some hit the side of the craft and harmlessly bounced off. The side of the boat was made of some material stretched taut across its wooden framework. My hand instinctively touched the side of the boat. It felt like animal hide. I looked ahead as we were battered by another gust of northern wind. The mist swirled and lifted as we passed through it, and I could see the ghostly outline of what looked like a large land mass. The mist parted, and before us was a blinding field of ice. Cliffs of gray and pink seemed to levitate in the air beyond the ice field, like monolithic apparitions. Wisps of clouds clung to the mountain top. In places they reached so low that it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference between cloud and ice. The cold, barren landscape was like nothing I had seen before. It was as if I was staring into the beauty of heaven and the extremity of hell. I was in awe of what seemed to be my destination, but I feared the cold and the vastness of this land. It left me with an empty feeling in the center of my stomach. The snow-covered land reminded me of something Eric had described to me. We cast anchor and went ashore, and we could see no grass there. The background was all great glaciers, and right up to the glaciers from the sea to the land was like a flat stone. The land was barren and useless. I will call it Helluland. The only sound was the ceaselessly blowing wind. I don't know how long I gazed at this barren and featureless land. I was so mesmerized by it that I hadn't noticed our craft beach on what looked to be a shelf of snow and ice. With perfect balance, one of the men stood and created a sort of equilibrium between the motion of the waves hitting the shore and the bobbing boat. The other stood and grabbed my hand, not in a forceful manner, but to escort me off the boat. Once on the shore, I noticed that I stood 2 full feet above the man. I was soon standing alone as he walked to an unmarked place in the snow and began digging. He put his hand under the snow and pulled out a snow-covered bundle of animal skins, tied together with a twine. He opened the bundle and pulled out a pair of fur pants and a fur coat. Kneeling down in front of me and holding the pants open, he gestured for me to step into them. I did so and found that they stopped the wind from blowing up my legs. The bottoms of the pants already had shoes sewn to the cuffs. The bottom of my habit fit nicely into the outfit. He reached around my torso and pulled twine sewn into the hide tightly around my waist. Next he pulled off the fur wrapping my shoulders and pulled the coat over me. Its design was as innovative as the pants. A hood was sewn onto it. Its pungent animal odor met my nostrils as the hood was pulled over my head. But I didn't mind the smell, considering the protection from the elements the outfit provided. He returned to the bundle and pulled out a frozen pink object. He put it in his mouth and sucked and chewed until it softened. Then he held it in front of my face. I instinctively recoiled. With his other mittened hand he gestured to his mouth, and I understood that he wanted me to eat the object. I didn't know what to do. The thought of ingesting saliva-soaked raw meat made me queasy, but I was very hungry, and I knew I needed to keep my strength up to traverse this ice field. So I gingerly took the meat from between his fingers. I tried to wipe off as much of his saliva as I could, then bit into it with my back teeth. I tasted blood and another taste that I wanted to ignore. I tried not to think of what I was eating. I kept telling myself that I was eating this for my own survival. He took out a second piece and gave it to me to melt. I duplicated his actions exactly. I told myself that in time, the taste would grow on me. I saw him kneel down and hit the snow and ice with his fist, till he broke through the crusty surface. He scooped up a chunk of ice and bit off a piece. I grabbed the snow without further instruction and bit into it. It was cold on my teeth and gums, but once it melted, I realized how thirsty I was. The native returned to the pack and bundled it up again and buried it in the snow. I guessed that this cache remained here and that there were other caches of food spread around this land. I could see the strategy of having them, though I wondered how those who left them were able to find them again. It was an ingenious way to make use of the environment. Why expend valuable energy to create a man-made storage unit when the natural world provided such a convenience? The frozen land would keep food from spoiling and the snow would keep it hidden from predators. I kept watch on my escort, realizing that without this man I was as good as dead in this strange land. I had a much better chance of survival back on that death ship. Unless there were animals to hunt here, I'd only have the snow for sustenance, and I knew that I could not survive only on water for too long. My escort waved for me to follow him across the white, glistening ground. The cold Arctic wind carved repetitive patterns in the hardened snow, like ocean waves frozen in time. A vast white ocean separated us from the distant mountains, for the snow extended all across the land. I could not be sure of the distance to the mountains, but I knew that it would be a long trek, taking at least 2 days, maybe longer. I didn't have any means of communicating with this native. I knew that we'd have to develop a way. Up until now, we'd communicated through hand gestures that I deciphered correctly, but without a systematic way of communicating, I wasn't sure that I was getting my full message across, or correctly interpreting his either. I didn't know if his people communicated with words. What I had heard sounded like mumbling to me. I couldn't distinguish my familiar pattern from the murmur. I later learned that the native words began with a root sound, and then other sounds were added as the suffix. He turned and began walking toward the mountains, neither telling me he was going nor waiting for me. I quickly realized that he had no intention of assisting me on this leg of our journey. It appeared that I was to trek across the ice field under my own locomotion. I bundled my outer clothing around me and followed him across the barren land. I was still weak from the ocean ordeal, but found that the meat and the snow banished my intermittent dizziness and helped to restore a little of my strength. My hunger had subsided for the moment, but my body was still craving water. During our trip, I always had a mitt full of snow ready to bite into. The day was waning. I didn't know how long we had walked. My mind drifted in and out of focus, sometimes dwelling on the last few daggers, occasionally interrupted by a fear that if I didn't keep moving, this land would be my prison. There would be no need for chains and dark pits for my crimes. The ice and the ocean would keep me imprisoned here. I felt helpless, small, and insignificant. The rapidly setting sun had turned the side of the mountain ahead a gentle rose hue, and the shadows created by the mammoth mountains were a calming blue. Strangely, this was very calming to me. My guide was still in the lead. In fact, he stopped several times so I didn't fall too far behind. The continuous wind stole away my wheezing cries to stop and rest. The close of the day marked the limit of my strength. I was rapidly weakening. My headache and the ache in my side had returned. I didn't know how much farther I could travel. Suddenly, the land began to spin. It whirled into a sea of white, and then I felt myself falling into a well of darkness.